back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard R.J. Eskow. My next guest is Chesa Boudin. Chesa is the district attorney for the city of San Francisco, and he is engaged in a recall election. We're going to be talking about that in a minute, but before we begin, first of all, welcome to the program, Chesa Boudin. And secondly, I wanted to note before we begin that our mothers knew one another. My mother worked for the freedom of Chesa's mother, Kathy Boudin, and who died recently, and our sympathies to you. And I understand today is your mother's birthday. Is that correct?
That's right, Richard, and it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show, and thank you for the courage that your mother demonstrated throughout her life. And I know growing up in the community she grew up in, you grew up in, what she did took a tremendous amount of principle and integrity, and it wasn't an easy thing, but I and my family appreciate it, and it is so fitting that we're talking together today, less than 3 weeks after my mother's death on her birthday. I know that our mothers would be proud of us making this connection and continuing to do the work that I know motivated them throughout their lives.
Absolutely. Extremely well said. Well, and I want to say that I've followed your career for some time, and I was very pleased to see you elected as district attorney of San Francisco with a very progressive and sane platform. Perhaps if you don't mind, just briefly, encapsulating what that platform was, so that we can kind of set up what's happening now. Would you do that, please?
Absolutely, Richard. When I ran for district attorney in 2019, I had a very detailed, clear, transparent platform. It was the most detailed policy program of any of the candidates in the race. At core, to boil it down, our three core promises were, first of all, to end mass incarceration, to stop relying on jails and prisons as primary responses to so many of our social ills: housing, mental illness, drug addiction, poverty. And second, and related, to reinvest savings from effective decarceration in victim services, expanding victims' rights, language access, actually meeting the needs of people who have been harmed by crimes. And third, in some ways, this is the most radical of the three promises: a promise to actually enforce the laws equally, to have a system of justice that works for everybody, not only the wealthy and well-connected. And that meant police accountability. It meant going after corporations that steal wages from their employees. It meant ensuring that we end discriminatory practices like cash bail, for example. Right. Those were the three promises we made, and I've been working hard in the last 2.5 years to deliver.
And, one of the things that strikes me about the progressive district attorney movement, Chesa Boudin, is I grew up in an era where, black and white rerun TV shows with the DA, the cigar and the fedora, kind of hard-nosed, picking on lower income people and that kind of thing. And I really think of the movement that you represent as being a kind of holistic view of what it means to really engage in law enforcement, which is, it's a reaffirmation and a regeneration of the values of a community, right? It is not just enforcement of the law against the, most visible offenders, but against all the offenders, and a kind of restoration of balance. If that makes any sense at all to you, I think that's what you're, to me, that's what you and a couple other great figures in this movement represent, is this sense of sanity and balance, and that law ultimately is justice in its fullest sense. Does that make any sense to you at all?
Absolutely. And let me just follow up on that, Richard, because look, the traditional approach to prosecution that prosecutors take, as you pointed out, it's the approach that led us to mass incarceration, to the state where the United States of America incarcerates more people than any other country in the history of the planet. And it has not rehabilitated people who commit crimes. It has not uplifted or healed harm caused to victims. And in the process, it's decimated not only our communities of color, but it's bankrupted governments and prevented us from investing in healthcare and housing and education, the kinds of things that make strong and safe communities. The traditional prosecutor was focused on securing as many convictions for as long a sentence as possible. It's not a effective way to promote public safety because it is reactive. It waits until harm occurs. It waits until someone is shot and killed and only then gets involved. My approach, the approach of the progressive prosecutors trying to reform our justice system, is a proactive approach. I want to give you an example of what I mean by that. We know that gun violence is probably the biggest threat to public safety, not just in San Francisco, but anywhere in this country. Gun violence is on the rise. It's easier to get guns. And now you can buy guns with no serial numbers off the internet. They're called ghost guns. They're untraceable. In San Francisco, in my first year in office, 2020, ghost guns were involved in about 50% of gun-related homicides. It is a major, major problem for public safety. And that's why, among other things, I filed a groundbreaking lawsuit against 3 companies manufacturing ghost guns, profiting off of shipping weapons of destruction into our communities. We're not going to sit back and wait for another person to be murdered. We're going to take the fight to the people at the root of the problem. That's what it means to be proactive. That's what it means to lead with a public safety first approach instead of simply reacting after a crime is committed and hoping police can arrest the person and then being punitive.
And, another point I wanted to make, that sounds great, Cesar Budina. Another point I wanted to make is that not only does the sort of quote unquote traditional model of policing and a district attorney work lead to enormous injustices, mass incarceration, the injustice of cash bail, and so on. But it reminds me, if you forgive me, of the old joke about, terrible food in such small portions. It doesn't seem to reduce crime. So even if you were utterly, brutally utilitarian about it, it seems that all the money we spend, all the abuses we engender through the older model of policing and enforcement, it seems to me we're creating recidivism, we're dividing communities, we're making people, making it harder for returning convicted people to obtain jobs and so on. It doesn't strike me, obviously this is not my field, but it doesn't strike me that there's any compelling evidence that this inhumane system is even efficient at doing what it's supposed to do.
That's exactly right, Richard. In fact, it's the opposite. We have compelling evidence that things like mental health diversion or drug treatment program, especially for lower level crimes, are far more effective at preventing future crime than jailing people. We have compelling evidence that jailing people is, in fact, I'm going to use a technical term here that criminologists use. It's criminogenic. It actually creates future crime. Imagine you take someone who's down on their luck, unhoused, and is stealing food to get through the day. And you take them, you put them in a jail, and you hold them there for a week or a month or 6 months. And when they get out, not only are they less likely to be able to get a job or find housing, but they've just spent the last however many months surrounded by people who might be violent criminals, who might be people who are causing real harm. And, you talk about, I'm sorry, we've got phone calls coming in here. I've got to figure out how to mute them. You talk about people, learning or graduating from low-level crimes to more serious crimes. We know that the status quo approach that traditional prosecutors have taken is actually a breeding ground for more serious crime. Intervening with diversion programs. And I want to give you some hard numbers here, right? This is what data shows, evidence-based practices and policies. In San Francisco, over a 10-year period, going back way before my administration, people who were referred to diversion programs were 20% less likely to get rearrested than people similarly situated, same criminal background, demographics, same charges, who were prosecuted using traditional tools. It makes it harder for people to get jobs, to pay taxes, to take care of their families when we put criminal convictions on them, when we put them in cages. Obviously, violent crime, there are categories of cases and individuals where we don't have better options than jails or prisons. But what we've seen over the last 100 years in this country is a blind reliance on jails and prisons to respond to everything from marijuana to jaywalking to murder. And we need to have more narrowly tailored, case-specific interventions that can actually help prevent future crime. That's what we're doing in San Francisco.
And you were elected, Chesa Boudin, if I recall correctly, in late 2019, took office beginning of 2020. And just for the record, you won that election. That's why you became district attorney. And if I recall correctly, there was an attempt to recall you that I think didn't get sufficient signatures. Then there was another one that did get sufficient signatures. And now you're confronted with a recall election. I imagine absentee ballots are already being submitted. I think the date is June 7th, if I recall. First of all, do I have all that right?
That's all right. Over 30,000 ballots have already been received by the Department of Elections. People are voting every day by mail in San Francisco. And everything you said is exactly accurate. The one thing I want to add to be clear is the first recall attempt that was led by a failed Republican mayoral candidate was primarily volunteer-based. The second one that succeeded in getting enough signatures to qualify for the ballot spent more than $1.5 million paying people from out of town to come in, and they paid them per signature that they collected from San Francisco residents. So that's what's at issue here is out of town Republican donors. In fact, the biggest donor to the recall is someone who gave Mitch McConnell over $6 million to seize control of the Senate, pack the Supreme Court, and attack everything that we as San Franciscans, as progressives, as Democrats hold dear.
So this is primarily, or it's a Republican-funded effort, it sounds like. And before we get into the claims they're making or the arguments they're making, why do you think, other than general dislike of progressives or what have you, why have they targeted you?
There's a playbook across the country, and we're seeing any reform-minded prosecutor, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Kim Foxx in Chicago, Gascon in Los Angeles, being targeted. And the reason is because we are actually doing the work to change a system that has not worked for anybody except the wealthy and powerful. It has worked to ensure impunity for police officers that kill. It's worked to ensure that prison guard unions can continue to profit off of mass incarceration. It has worked to ensure that billionaires and gig economy companies can safely steal from their employees and undermine public safety for all of us without any consequences. And we are fighting to change that system, to uplift communities. And look, Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, traces mass incarceration all the way back to slavery. The connections are clear, they're well documented. And we are fighting against a system grounded in white supremacy and historic oppression and exclusion of immigrants and people of color. And we're doing work that fundamentally challenges a deeply entrenched status quo. And folks with power don't like that. They don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to see a system that protects their interests change to a system that works for all of us. And so they're targeting us, and they're using a playbook, recall elections, fear-mongering, exploiting the kinds of tragedies that occur in any big city in America. And they're amplifying them and dishonestly suggesting that they're a result of criminal justice reform, when in reality, we know they're a result of decades of mass incarceration, of underinvestment in communities of color, and of systematic exclusion of entire classes of people from access to services and the full benefits of modern American life.
So, Chesa Boudin, if I try to analyze the forces that might want to see you removed from office. Well, clearly what you've just described, you mentioned the new Jim Crow, the commodification of Black bodies leading back to slavery. And, there's a whole industry, as you well know, and as our listeners know, built up around the prison, the penal system, and so on. There might be, for example, corporate interests that don't want to be investigated by the district attorney of San Francisco. There's police unions who might not like the shift in power. I'm just trying to get a kind of a architecture of who you're up against here. And then there are ideologues, right, who just don't want to see a shift away from their sort of oppressive, the system that we've had up to now. Is that what you're up against, or is it just people who hate you, or I mean, in other words, are people's oxes being gored by this, or is it more of an ideological thing? If you get that question,
I do. I mean, look, I want to be really honest. I mean, there is a problem with crime in many American cities, including San Francisco. We have crimes committed every day. We have victims of crime. We have people who see videos of crime and live in fear. And we have not yet managed, especially in the context of a global pandemic, to solve all of the problems with public safety. And so there are people who are legitimately and genuinely and fairly concerned about their safety and the safety of their loved ones. Sure. And the problem is what we're seeing is people like Bill Oberndorf, this Republican billionaire oligarch who's bankrolled the Republican takeover of the Senate and packing of the Supreme Court. We're seeing people like them, Tucker Carlson on Fox News, Senator Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz, tweeting about San Francisco, their support for the recall against me. They're exploiting the kinds of fear that are normal when anybody cares about their loved one and sees crime on TV or hears about crime or is a victim of crime. They're exploiting that fear to suggest that if only we were more punitive, if only we went back to the policies of mass incarceration that were so horrific from the standpoint of racial disparities, from the standpoint of bankrupting local government, from the standpoint, frankly, of creating more crime, that somehow we'd be safe. And we know that's not true, but fear is powerful. And these folks have a lot of money and they have big platforms. And yes, they want, at a national level, they want places like San Francisco that are solidly democratic, that are leading the way on things like marriage equality, marijuana decriminalization, and yes, criminal justice reform. They want San Francisco to be viewed as a failure. They want people in red states like Oklahoma and Missouri and Arkansas to say, after watching Fox News, oh my gosh, that looks like Mad Max. It looks like dystopia. We can't vote for that. It's dishonest, it's exploitative, and it's undermining public safety across this country.
And, it's interesting, as you mentioned that, Jason, I was thinking of, you mentioned Kim Foxx in Chicago. Certainly the right-wing noise machine has done a lot to demonize Chicago as well and to exaggerate the crime statistics there. Now, if I were a citizen of San Francisco, didn't follow the news very much, I might look at some of the claims they make and think, yeah, it makes sense. But given that I do follow the news for a living, I look at the figures, for example, I looked a little bit at the arguments they're making against you, and they're saying that certain types of crime went up after you took office. Well, it seems to me if someone takes office in January of 2020, there was kind of a big event, right, that happened in the first quarter of 2020 that might have had some influence on the statistics we're talking about here. Is that a fair observation?
Richard, I would love to be able to tell you that in my policies in just a couple of months in office, were making a bigger impact on San Francisco than the COVID pandemic, but it's just not real. It's just not real. I was in office less than 2 months before COVID shut down our city, right. and we had a shelter-in-place order. Our courts closed. Crime trends dramatically shifted during the pandemic, not just in San Francisco, but across the country. And what we saw in San Francisco was in many ways consistent with trends in other cities, except our violent crime rate remains at historic lows. And our property crime rate actually fell dramatically in the first year of the pandemic. We've seen, and this is going to shock people, and I know it doesn't mean much if you or someone you love was a victim of crime, but in the 2.5 years that I've been in office, compared with the 2.5 years before I was in office, there have been 28,000 fewer reported crimes in San Francisco. 28,000 fewer reported crimes. Now, I'd love to take credit for that. The way that the folks supporting the recall blame me for the individual categories or neighborhoods or time frames when a particular kind of crime has gone up. The reality is there are forces much, much bigger than me or any district attorney, and any honest criminal law expert, criminologist will tell you that district attorneys and the policies we implement do not have the ability to move crime trends in the short term. We just don't. It takes years for the cases we file to work their way through the court system. Criminologists that study recidivism or the rate at which people are rearrested usually measure that rate in 3-year increments. I haven't even been in office for 3 years. They started this recall. They registered the domain for the recall website the week I was sworn into office. So we know what's going on here, right? It's fear-mongering, it's pandering, it's exploiting the anxiety and the genuine concern that all people of conscience have experienced over the last couple of years in the context of this pandemic. And it's manipulating that to undermine criminal justice reform policies that are evidence-based and that are effectively ending mass incarceration, supporting crime victims, and holding those in power accountable.
So one of the things they do, and this strikes me as a tactic that is becoming increasingly common on the right, is we saw it with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, for example. They take individual cases out of context and they misrepresent them, they turn them into anecdotes. We've seen that in the recall effort against you, that you said this about that case, or maybe a disgruntled former staffer says you said this about that. I may not be completely accurately summarizing it, but
no, you're doing pretty good.
Okay, good. And this is sort of, it feels like a whisper campaign. It feels like you could take anybody in any job at any time and just pick out little elements and frame them however you want, rather than looking, for example, at overall statistics, whether crime statistics or anything else. They did it with Justice Jackson. They're doing it with you. There's, I was just reading today about this group that systematically attacks everyone, especially the better appointees that Joe Biden has put in office and so on, like Sarah Bloom Raskin. So how do you combat that, I guess? I mean, I suppose you're in the process of finding out now, but I mean, what are your thoughts about how one responds to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. I run a government agency with 300 employees. I inherited more than 5,000 criminal cases on day one. The courts almost entirely shut down 2 months later. If you cherry pick and put under the microscope any individual case or any individual government agency, of course you're going to find mistakes. And my DA's office is no different. We have people, including myself, that make mistakes. Some people cut corners, unfortunately. Some people have poor judgment. That's the nature of running a government agency, especially when you're trying to do it over Zoom. There's going to be problems. And what we've seen is more than $5 million, mostly Republican money, pumping into this race to amplify and manipulate and spin any individual case that you'd find in district attorney offices across the country to suggest that somehow I personally or criminal justice reform more broadly is responsible for those things. And often they're not mistakes. Often there's the system working the way it's supposed to, the way the law requires that it does. For example, we can't use evidence that's illegally obtained. That's not criminal justice reform. That's the U.S. Constitution. And yet we see them manipulating these kinds of basic fundamental things. So your question was, what do we do about it? How do we push back? Well, the first thing is we continue to be proactive and principled in communicating our vision and following through on our promises and on uplifting the voices of the social movements that led to my election in the first place. And that looks like a massive grassroots campaign. I am tremendously proud of the coalition of support we've built against this recall. Not just progressives, but mainstream moderate Democrats and institutions that opposed my election in the first place, but that are now standing with us to reject the Republican con, to reject the recall. The San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, the Bay Area Reporter, and just earlier today, Singtao, the biggest Chinese language media group in the entire San Francisco Bay Area, have all endorsed us against this recall. But it's not just the news media. It's not just all of the leading papers in San Francisco. It's also the San Francisco Democratic Party, almost unanimously voting to reject this recall. It's the San Francisco Labor Council. It's the majority of our members of the Board of Supervisors, and almost every single elected official in San Francisco who's taken a position has said, vote no on Proposition H, reject the recall. Our nurses, our teachers, our in-home healthcare workers, the union that represents the victim advocates in my office, the union that represents our city college professors. Far and wide, people of all different political backgrounds and language groups are saying this recall will not make us safer. It will undermine justice. Vote no.
And yet, Chesa Boudin, there is, and I have thoughts about Poland, but the polls suggest that you have a tough fight on your hands. What are your thoughts about that?
We do have a tough fight on our hands. We're up against massive amounts of money. We're up against a climate where people are living in fear, in part because of the pandemic, in part because of changing crime trends, and in part because of an exponential increase in media coverage of crime. And so I absolutely do believe we have a fight on our hands. The polls, every one of them shows that we are right now underwater, notwithstanding those endorsements, notwithstanding the fact that crime has actually gone down under my administration, notwithstanding the fact that I'm doing exactly what I promised voters I would, and that evidence shows will make our city safer in the long run. We have a serious fight ahead of us. And as we talk here today, we have just 19 days to go until the election. That means it's all hands on deck. We need people to volunteer. We need phone banking. We need donations, even if they're small. We need people to get involved. Yesterday, we had a phone bank, and John Legend joined the phone bank by Zoom to thank our volunteers, to encourage them to continue pushing for these last 19 days. I started my morning yesterday by calling 70 undecided voters myself and talking to them and sharing the work that we're doing that we're proud of, and asking them to allow me to finish the job I was elected to do, to allow me to finish my 4-year term.
So I'm going to ask, before I let you go, where people can go to learn more and possibly help. But before I do that, a quick philosophical question, if I may, for lack of a better word, which is before you became district attorney, you were a public defender. And some people would say that's crossing the aisle or, switching sides or whatever. What was that like for you? How was that, if at all, a difference in outlook and perspective for you?
Well, it is crossing the aisle in some ways, but it's not switching parties the way it would be to go from Democrat to Republican. Look, the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in this country are mostly former prosecutors, right? They understand how the other side thinks. They can anticipate. It's like a game of chess. You can anticipate the moves your opponent will make in a litigation matter. You can have relationships that help to negotiate cases successfully. And let's remember, you mentioned Supreme Court Justice Jackson not long ago. She was a public defender early in her career. And the Republicans in the Senate tried to derail her nomination, her historic nomination, by cherry picking individual cases where she had zealously advocated for her client. Now, let's be very clear about what a lawyer's ethical obligation is. It's to fight as hard as they can within the bounds of the law for the person or group they represent. As a public defender, my clients were individual people, and I fought hard for them, and I did it with pride, and I did it effectively. Now, as San Francisco's district attorney, I have the honor of representing the people of the city and county of San Francisco. And I fight hard for the people of this city and county. And I do my job zealously because we deserve better and more, and I'm fighting every day to deliver. It's different primarily in the sense that, yes, I'm still litigating criminal cases. I'm still in front of the same judges and juries. But now I don't just represent the interests of one person. I represent the interests of all the people of the city and county of San Francisco, victims of crime, people we're prosecuting, their families, businesses, constituent groups. I represent everybody. And so we have a challenging balancing act. Justice and safety have to meet together in the courtrooms where my lawyers argue cases.
Well, where can people go to support you and your campaign. Is there a website? Is there something? I assume there is. All the kids are doing
There's a few websites, and I'll give them to you. One that you can go to, of course, is just ChesaBoudin.com if you want information there. It's just my full name.com. We have another one specific to this recall, which is StopTheRepublicanCon.com. And if you go to the events page there, you can see events we have coming up, phone banks, text banks, going door to door. This is a grassroots field campaign. We are talking to voters. We are providing voters with information so that they can be informed about who is behind this recall, about what the facts are, and about the need to stand up for our democracy, stand up against Republicans, stand up, as we say in the recall, and stop the RepublicanCon.com.
Well, Chesa Boudin, current and hopefully future district attorney of San Francisco, thanks for all your great work, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you again for all the work your mother did.
Oh, thank you so much. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard R.J. Escalin. This is the Zero Hour.